Hello, my friends. Welcome to Learning English with Nhat Lin. I'm so happy you are here with me today. In this lesson, we are going to explore the history of how the United States was formed, how a new nation was born from struggle, hope, and big ideas. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let us begin our journey together. Take a moment and imagine a land without highways, without tall buildings, without the sound of cars or machines. Imagine endless forests stretching toward the horizon, rivers moving slowly through wide valleys, mountains standing quiet and strong under an open sky. The air is clean. The nights are dark and filled with stars. Have you ever wondered what America looked like before it was called America? Long before there was a flag or a president or even a single city, this land was already alive. For thousands of years, Native American tribes lived across the continent. They did not call it the United States. They did not draw borders on maps. To them, the land was not something to own. It was something to respect. In the forests of the East, tribes built villages near rivers. They hunted deer and grew corn, beans, and squash. In the Great Plains, others followed the movement of buffalo herds across open grasslands. In the Southwest, communities built homes from clay and stone, creating cities in the desert long before Europeans arrived. Along the Pacific coast, tribes fished in cold ocean waters and carved large wooden canoes. Each group had its own language, its own stories, its own traditions. Some were small and moved often. Others built complex societies with trade networks and political systems. They lived by the rhythm of the season. They watched the sky. They understood the land in ways that would later surprise newcomers. This continent was not empty. It was not silent. It was a world of cultures, beliefs, and deep connections to nature. But far across the Atlantic Ocean, another world was changing. European nations were searching for new trade routes, new land, and new wealth. Ships were being built. Maps were being drawn. Curiosity and ambition were growing stronger every year. Soon, wooden ships would cross the ocean. Sailors would look at this vast land with new eyes. They would give it new names, and everything would begin to change. The story of the United States did not start with a declaration or a battle. It began with a meeting between worlds that did not yet understand each other. In the late 1400s, European explorers began sailing farther than ever before. They were searching for new trade routes to Asia, hoping to find spices, gold, and riches. In 1492, an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean under the Spanish flag. He believed he had reached Asia. Instead, he had arrived in a land unknown to Europe. Columbus was not the first human to stand on this continent. Millions of Native Americans were already living there, but his journey changed history. News of this new world spread quickly across Europe. Soon, Spain, France, and England began sending their own ships across the ocean. Spain built settlements in the south, in places that would later become Florida and parts of the American Southwest. French explorers traveled along rivers in the north, especially the Mississippi River, building trading posts and forming alliances with native tribes. But it was England that would play the largest role in the creation of what would become the United States. In 1607, English settlers built Jamestown in Virginia. It was the first permanent English settlement in North America. Life there was extremely difficult. The settlers were not experienced farmers. Many were gentlemen who had never worked the land before. They faced hunger, disease, and conflict with local tribes. During the first winters, many died. Survival is a simple word. It means staying alive in difficult conditions. And in Jamestown, survival was never guaranteed. More English settlers followed. In 1620, a small ship called the Mayflower carried a group of religious families across the Atlantic. They are often called the Pilgrims. They were seeking religious freedom, the right to worship in their own way. After a long and dangerous journey, they landed far north of Virginia in a place they named Plymouth. Winter came quickly. The cold was harsh. Food was scarce. Nearly half of the settlers died during the first year. But they did not disappear. With help from Native Americans, who taught them how to grow corn and survive the land, they slowly built a stable community. A colony is a settlement built by people who leave their home country to live in a new land, but still remain connected to their original nation. Over time, more colonies were created along the eastern coast. Families arrived from England looking for opportunity. Farmers, workers, merchants, and craftsmen built towns and farms. By the early 1700s, there were 13 English colonies stretching from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. Life in the colonies was not easy, but it offered something powerful: land, work, and the possibility of a better future. Many people believed they had found a new beginning. Yet these colonies were still under British control. The King of England ruled from far away. Laws were made across the ocean. As the colonies grew stronger and more confident, tensions slowly began to rise. The seeds of a new nation had been planted, but no one yet knew what they would become. By the early 1700s, the 13 colonies along the eastern coast were growing quickly. Small settlements had become busy towns. Farms produced tobacco, rice, and wheat. Ships carried goods across the Atlantic Ocean. Merchants traded with Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. The colonies were no longer fragile experiments. They were becoming strong and confident communities, yet they were still British. The King of England ruled from thousands of miles away. The colonists were British subjects. They spoke English. They followed British laws. Many still felt proud to be part of the British Empire. But distance changes relationships, and across the ocean, misunderstandings began to grow. In the mid-1700s, Britain fought a long and expensive war against France. This conflict, known in America as the French and Indian War, was fought partly on North American soil. Britain won the war, but victory came at a high price. The British government was deeply in debt. To solve this problem, Parliament, the British lawmaking body, decided the colonies should help pay for the war. New taxes were introduced. A tax is money people must pay to the government. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This law required colonists to pay a tax on printed materials such as newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. Later came the Tea Act, which placed taxes on tea imported into the colonies. At first, these taxes might not seem unusual. Governments often collect taxes, but the colonists were angry for one important reason. They had no representatives in Parliament. They had no voice in the decisions being made. They began to repeat a powerful phrase: no taxation without representation. Representation means having someone speak for you in government. The colonists believed that if they were going to be taxed, they should have elected officials in Parliament. But Britain refused. Protests began quietly. Merchants boycotted British goods. This means they refused to buy them. Groups of colonists met in taverns and town halls to discuss their rights. Newspapers printed strong opinions. Voices grew louder. In 1770, tension turned violent in Boston. British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, killing 5 men. This event became known as the Boston Massacre. The word massacre suggests a large number of deaths, but in this case, the emotional impact was more powerful than the number itself. It shocked the colonies. 3 years later, in 1773, protests took a dramatic form. In Boston Harbor, a group of colonists boarded British ships carrying tea. They threw 342 chests of tea into the water. This event became famous as the Boston Tea Party. It was not a party in the modern sense. It was an act of protest, a clear message to Britain. The British government responded harshly. They closed Boston's port and passed strict new laws to punish the colony of Massachusetts. Instead of calming the situation, these actions united the colonies even more. For the first time, leaders from different colonies gathered together. They formed the First Continental Congress in 1774. They discussed their rights, their grievances, and their future. Grievances are strong complaints about unfair treatment. What began as frustration over taxes was becoming something larger. The colonists were starting to question not just specific laws, but British rule itself. They were no longer simply British subjects living far from home. They were beginning to see themselves as something new, something separate. And soon, disagreement would turn into war. By 1775, tension between Britain and the colonies had reached a breaking point. Words were no longer enough. Meetings, protests, and petitions had failed to bring change. Now both sides were preparing for something far more serious: war. The first shots were fired in April 1775 in the towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. British soldiers had marched there to seize colonial weapons. Instead, they met local militia, ordinary farmers and workers who had taken up arms. No one knows who fired the first shot, but that moment changed everything. The American Revolutionary War had begun. At first, many colonists were unsure. Some still hoped to repair their relationship with Britain. Others believed independence was the only solution. The word independence means freedom from control by another country. It was a bold idea, dangerous, even. Britain was one of the most powerful empires in the world. The colonies had no large army, no navy, and little money, but they had determination. In June 1775, the colonies created the Continental Army and chose George Washington as its leader. Washington was not a loud or dramatic man. He was steady, disciplined, and respected. He understood that winning this war would require patience as much as courage. The war was long and difficult. The British Army was trained and well-equipped. The colonial soldiers often lacked proper uniforms, weapons, and food. During the winter of 1777, Washington's army camped at Valley Forge. The cold was brutal. Many soldiers had no shoes. Hunger and disease spread through the camp, yet they did not give up. In the middle of war, something extraordinary happened. On July 4, 1776, representatives from the 13 colonies approved a document that would change history: the Declaration of Independence. This document, written mainly by Thomas Jefferson, announced that the colonies were no longer under British rule. It declared that all men are created equal and are given certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty means freedom, the freedom to live without unfair control. These words were powerful. They were not just political statements. They were ideas that would inspire people around the world for centuries. But at that moment, they were also a risk. By signing the Declaration, the leaders were committing treason against the British Crown. If they lost the war, they could be executed. The fighting continued for years. Battles were fought in forests, towns, and open fields. Families were divided. Some colonists remained loyal to Britain. Others fought fiercely for independence. The war was not simple or united. It was a civil conflict as much as an international one. Slowly, the tide began to turn. In 1778, France decided to support the American colonies, sending money, soldiers, and ships. This alliance gave the Americans new strength. With French help, the colonial army forced a major British surrender at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. 2 years later, in 1783, Britain officially recognized American independence in the Treaty of Paris. After 8 long years of struggle, a new nation had been born. But victory did not mean stability. The colonies were now free, but freedom brought new questions. How would they govern themselves? How would 13 separate states become one country? Revolution is a powerful word. It means a complete and sudden change, often through force. The American Revolution had broken political ties with Britain, but building something new would require something even more difficult than war. It would require unity, compromise, and vision. The United States had declared its independence. Now it had to prove it could survive. Winning independence was only the beginning. After the war ended in 1783, the former colonies faced a new and serious challenge: how to govern themselves. During the war, the states had created a simple plan for cooperation called the Articles of Confederation. This document gave power to the individual states and created a weak central government. At first, this seemed like a safe choice. The colonies had just fought a king. They did not want another strong central authority. But soon, problems appeared. The national government could not collect taxes directly. It could not regulate trade between states. It could not easily raise an army. Each state printed its own money. Laws were inconsistent. Disagreements between states became more common. The young nation felt fragile. Fragile means easily broken. Leaders began to worry. If the states continued to act separately, the new country might collapse. In 1787, representatives from 12 of the 13 states met in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the Constitutional Convention. Their goal was to fix the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they decided to create something entirely new. The result was the United States Constitution. A constitution is a written document that explains how a government works. It defines the powers of leaders and protects the rights of citizens. The delegates debated for months. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states wanted equal representation. After long arguments, they reached a compromise. Congress would have two parts. The House of Representatives would reflect population. The Senate would give each state two representatives. They also created a system of checks and balances. This meant that no single branch of government would have too much power. The government would have three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Each branch could limit the power of the others. Checks and balances was a simple idea with deep meaning. Power must be shared to prevent abuse. But not everyone agreed with the new constitution. Some feared the central government would still become too strong. To address these concerns, leaders added the Bill of Rights in 1791. This was a list of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It guaranteed basic freedoms such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to a fair trial. These rights were meant to protect individuals from government control. Slowly, the Constitution was accepted by all 13 states. The United States now had a stronger, more stable system of government. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. The nation was still small. It was still uncertain. It faced economic struggles and political disagreements. But it had something powerful, a framework for unity. The American experiment was no longer just a rebellion. It was becoming a functioning republic, a country governed not by a king, but by laws and elected leaders. The United States had won its freedom. Now it had built its foundation, and the world was watching to see whether this new idea of government could truly survive. By the end of the 1700s, the United States was no longer just a group of former colonies. It was a nation, young, uncertain, but full of possibility. George Washington served 2 terms as president and then stepped down peacefully. This simple decision became one of the most important traditions in American history. It showed that power could be given up voluntarily. The country would not depend on one man. It would depend on laws. Other leaders followed. New political parties formed. Debates filled newspapers and town halls. The young republic faced challenges from abroad, especially from powerful European nations still fighting their own wars. At home, farmers struggled with debt. Cities grew slowly. Roads were rough. Communication was slow. The United States was free, but freedom did not mean perfection. There was one deep contradiction that remained from the very beginning: slavery. While the Declaration of Independence had declared that all men are created equal, millions of enslaved African men, women, and children were forced to work without pay or rights. This painful reality stood in direct conflict with the nation's ideals. A contradiction is when two ideas do not agree with each other. Even in its earliest years, America carried both hope and injustice at the same time. Some leaders spoke out against slavery, others defended it. The problem was not solved at the nation's birth. It would grow into a conflict that future generations would have to face. Yet despite its flaws, the United States represented something new in the world. It was not ruled by a king. It did not inherit its power from royal blood. It was built on a written constitution and the belief that ordinary citizens could govern themselves. This idea was bold. It was fragile. Many countries watched carefully, wondering if this experiment would fail. But it did not disappear. From 13 small states along the Atlantic coast, the United States began to shape its own identity. It was not defined only by land or borders. It was defined by an idea: liberty, self-government, and the belief that people have rights that cannot simply be taken away. The story of America's formation is not just a story of war and documents. It is a story of risk, of disagreement, of courage, of imperfect people trying to build something new. Next time you hear the words United States, remember that it was not born in a single moment. It was shaped slowly, through struggle, compromise, and vision. A nation began not with certainty, but with hope.